Hello, this is Mike Saini speaking, and I'm going to be your host for the next three webinars on family violence. I'm from the University of Toronto in Canada. I'm a professor in the Faculty of Immatage, Faculty of Social Work, and cross-appointed with the Faculty of Law at the university. I'm also a parenting plan evaluator or child custody evaluator. I've been doing that for about 20 years. I teach a foundations of um, uh, parenting plan evaluations, and I've taught that at the school for many years with my colleague who has since passed, Lorraine Martin, who is my mentor. And I've been specifically interested in the study of family violence because it's so important to the work that we do as evaluators. And most recently, I co-edited a special issue for the Family Court Review with my colleagues, Robin Deutsch and Leslie Drowse, on family violence. And there we had a number of people, scholars, to submit articles on the topic of family violence. And I'm going to talk about that as we go through this time together. The three different sessions are laid out so that the first session is going to be talking about understanding the concepts related to family violence. The second webinar is going to be about screening, and I'm going to walk you through some of the measures and also some of the best practices around screening for family violence in the context of parenting plan evaluations. And then the third session is going to be on um, impact of family violence, both for children and parents, and then how to use that information within your parenting plan recommendations so that you are tapping into the indicators of impact, the behaviors, and the adjustment issues so that you can integrate that into a more thorough way of describing to the judge what you are noticing, observing, assessing, and then how to make specific indications into interventions to be recommended to ameliorate the situation in terms of both safety and well-being. So we have a lot to talk about, and I hope you enjoy the time that we're going to be spending together. And the first session is going to be on family violence in terms of the definitions, but more importantly, in terms of this notion of concept creep. And concept creep is, I think, an important area to be focusing in on because it really gets at the concept of harm and how harm has changed over time. And as evaluators, we need to be clear about what we mean by harm and how to integrate harm into the work that we're doing. So let's get going on the first session. So this first part will be on navigating the complexity and understanding of family violence in custody cases. And again, it's 1 hour in duration. And in this 1 hour webinar, to start us off, we're going to go over the definitions of family violence. And I'm using family violence as an umbrella term. And this will hopefully make more sense as we go forward. I'm also going to be talking about family violence within the ecology of the different parts. So the individual, so what's happening at the individual level, and then what's happening at the familial level, the relationship level, and then looking at it from a larger system and how these interact with each other. And so family violence is never in in isolation. It's in context of the ecological framework. And I think it's really important to understand the ecology of violence. And we're going to talk about that with the time that we have together. And then I'm also going to talk about concept creep. And concept creep is really important for parenting plan evaluators because it talks about harm and how harm has expanded over the years, and it now includes other forms of harm. And that has its advantages. Uh, it makes us more sensitive to various forms of harm and makes us more aware of current understandings of harm. But at the same time, it challenges us as evaluators because we now need to be thinking about how to measure, how to assess, how to integrate these new concepts of harm, concepts of violence in our evaluation work so that we can make sense of them. So the learning objectives for this session is to provide a comprehensive overview of family violence and also to emphasize the need to understand the multifaceted nature of family violence. So again, family violence is being considered as an umbrella term to include all forms of family violence. Before we get into definitions, I want to first talk about the 4 planets of family violence in the context of our work. And I'd like this 4-planet type of approach to help us, and to remind us of that we don't all come from the same planet when it comes to how we assess and how we think about family violence. And so, on the left top, we have family law. Within family law, the maximum contact principle is often at play, where family law is really about of course safety, but also making sure that people are resolving their disputes, and their disputes are often about time with children and financial considerations. And so these are oftentimes, parents who are disputing against each other, and where children can be silenced. Sometimes they're included. Sometimes there's voice of the child reports, or there's other ways of involving children in these disputes, but primarily the focus is on the parents resolving their disputes. The idea that if they can resolve their disputes, then they will positively impact their children. So they're more indirectly involved. From a child's right perspective, on the far right and top, this is really about children's voices. Now, there's a distinction between children's voices and children's choices, so voice versus choice. But the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, Article 12, says that every child who has something happening that involves them in the decision making should have their voices heard. And so from a child's right perspective, it may be that the children's voice is given the most weight in these situations. For example, where this may differ, we found in the article with Pruitt et al., where we did the study of alienation, we found that those who support or proponents of alienation are more likely to not give children's voices that much weight. Those who support a family violence perspective and the child does not want to go to the other parent, may give too much weight to children. And so making sure that children's rights are part of the equation, but not making sure we don't move into the issues of choice, and so that it replaces the importance of voice. And then we have child protection at the right bottom, where the safety of the child is considered to be paramount. There, the focus is really about dependency courts being involved, or child protection workers being involved, and their focus is to investigate and either to substantiate or not allegations of violence, allegations of child maltreatment, allegations of exposure to family violence. And so the focus is on the child. The child is considered to be the primary concern, and is the in situations of substantiated violence, they would be the child as victim. And then intimate partner violence at the far left sees family violence within oftentimes a gendered analysis, where the focus is on the violence at the couple level, where one is using power and control over the other. And so the focus is really on trying to support that person who is being impacted by the violence, and to put in safety considerations to protect them from future violence. And so you can see that depending on where professionals are at in terms of which planets they're from, they may have different ideas about how to think about family violence. Evaluators have been criticized for not spending enough time focusing in on the power and the power balances in the course of control. And so this type of training is really important for us to be updated, and for us to be mindful of these different shifts and these different ways of thinking about family violence, so that we can consider how best to integrate this into our evaluation work. Where we sit on this is going to be different than other professionals. For example, if you're in a shelter home, and so your focus is on intimate partner violence, that's what you are, that's what you are mandated to do, is to assist people who have been abused by violence. And somebody comes to your door and says that they've been abused, you're going to say, come on in, have a cup of tea, make yourself comfortable, let me make you a sandwich. You're going to welcome them in, because your role is to support them. Your role is not to determine the credibility of their statements. It's, if they say that they've been abused, then they have been abused. And there's no questions about that being asked. You would not ask about the credibility of those statements. If you were in child protection sphere, you would want to know the credibility of those statements, because you need to either substantiate or not. In the family law sphere, you'd want to know the credibility of the allegations, because there needs to be some substantiation, some assessment, some finding of violence or not, so that if violence is ruled out, then what's left is looking at the maximum right for maximum contact. And so violence can play into these issues. And so from an evaluator perspective, for example, if that same person, came to me and said that they've been abused, I wouldn't just say, come on in, have a cup of tea, I'll make you a sandwich. It would be, okay, so let's go through this. I'm going to ask you some questions about this, and this can be really difficult, and so take your time. Um, and one of the questions I'm going to ask is about corroborating evidence. Were the police called? Is there a police record? Did you go to the doctors? Is there a medical record? Did you tell your therapist about this? Can I speak to your therapist about this? I want to try and triangulate that evidence and those points of evidence, because my role as an evaluator is to assess the credibility. It is um, to either put weight on the occurrence of violence, or in some situations to assess that the allegations are false. And we can't take that lightly. This is challenging area of our work, and we need to be clear about what are we making findings about, or what are we putting weight on, and what are we suggesting should not be given weight, and what are the terms that are being used, and how do we measure those terms, and how do we integrate those into the work that we're doing. So it's complicated stuff, and we really have to have a good overall focus about family violence so that we can really get into the weeds and be clear and precise about what we mean when we talk about family violence. So part of the problem here is that there's no clear definition of family violence. There's many different definitions that have been offered, and some definitions provide more weight on some factors, some indicators than others. You have other definitions that more focus on domestic abuse or domestic violence. You have other ones that are more focused on intimate partner violence, and so more at the couple relationship. Where family violence is different is that it's being used here as an umbrella term. So it doesn't replace IPV. It doesn't replace child maltreatment or neglect. It doesn't replace other forms of violence, such as sibling abuse or elder abuse. It actually puts it all under one umbrella. And that way there, we can start thinking about the various forms of violence within this umbrella of violence. Here are some examples of types of violence within family violence. And these would be more at the the intimate partner relationship factors. But we have physical abuse. I mean, that was the one that in 1960s got some initial attention. The battered woman's syndrome was related to specifically physical harm. And then, the way that violence was portrayed in the media and has brought awareness, that has given this illusion that physical violence is the worst kind of violence, which it's not. It's a form of violence. There are other forms of violence that we need to be aware of as well. Sexual abuse, threats to kill or to harm, harassment, and in there, not only stalking, but also cyber stalking. So one of the factors that really goes through all of this is technology, and how technology has changed the way violence is understood and how violence is expressed online, and that could be a whole other talk, a whole other webinar. And there are people who do that, and I would encourage you to get additional training on technology and cyber abuse and cyber violence, because it's so critical for our work to understand how violence, not only face to face, not only in relationship, how that gets carried out in the online world, whether it be cyber stalking, whether it be using phones to hack, to spy, and to control people's whereabouts. And it's amazing what you can do with phones, and scary. So really getting a good understanding about that is critical to do this work. Failure to provide is another type of violence. If it's psychological, emotional, these are more challenging to assess and to intervene, because they're more up for interpretation, some would suggest. There are guidelines, and we'll talk about some of those guidelines about what is considered to be psychological abuse, what's considered to be emotional abuse. And I think it's really important as evaluators that we have a clear understanding about this. So it's not so vague, that we have a clear understanding about what we consider to be within the realm of emotional harm, so that we're clear in our descriptions about these types of harms, so that we can educate others as well in our writings about what we're using as our definitions of harm in these situations. Financial abuse is really important to consider. I just finished doing a report for Justice Canada on child support, and out of the 200 and some respondents, 30% there was no child support being passed as it should have been. And one of the big indicators of this non-transfer of funds was the presence of violence. And so how violence got played out in these situations where people were being threatened, saying, if you take me to court for child support, then I'll go after, care and control of the children. Or here's a lump sum, don't ask me for any more, I don't want to ever see you again. Or the opposite would be like, here's a little bit, if you need more, come see me, don't go to court. If you go to court, I'm not going to pay you, but if you come to me, I'll continue to give you some money. And that way it's an additional way of trying to control. And then threats to kill or harm, damage property, and the issues around pets, and then actual killing or harming pets or property. So family violence in this context, and I could go into the definitions of child maltreatment and neglect and elder abuse, but all of these are from a violence, family violence umbrella, where there's family violence is basically a hypernym for various forms of other types of violence. And this allows us to, within this umbrella of family violence, be clear about the different types of violence that is occurring within relationships, within family relationships. And so we're not looking at this in terms of well, child maltreatment, we'll look at that first, and then we'll look at family violence or IPV, and then we'll look at some other form of violence. This is an umbrella approach where we're looking at all forms of violence that may be impacting this family, which allows us to create safety measures, safety plans within our parenting plans that cover the range of and types of violence that may be occurring within those relationships. The problem with moving into a broader definition of family violence as an umbrella approach is that what do you put in that umbrella? What do you put in that definition of family violence? And we know that over time, new concepts have come into this broader notion of family violence. For example, legal abuse is a more recent one. Gaslighting is another one. So how do those fit in with our understanding of family violence? Where does coercive control fit into our understanding of family violence? And is that different than situational violence or separated um, uh, specific types of violence, where violence occur at the time of separation, where there's nothing before, nothing after, and it wasn't, based on coercive control. So understanding the different types of violence that we're experiencing in this work while observing folks is so critical because it makes us more precise. So one of the considerations for concept creep is this notion of semantic inflation of harm. And so concept creep is really just the expansion of a concept that otherwise did not include other forms of harm, but now does. So for example, bullying was considered to be something very specific. And now it's grown into, well, everybody's bullying each other. I mean, that word is now thrown around imprecisely and without necessarily intention to its original definition. And now we also have cyberbullying as another way of thinking about bullying. And now we have workplace bullying. So the term has moved into different ways of thinking about harm. And this semantic inflation means that as the term, like bullying, receives greater public attention and awareness, the term itself starts to expand and include more of a range of harm within its definition. So expanded notions of harm in terms of family violence. Some of these include, emotional harm. I mentioned, when you look back at the 1960s, where it was focused mostly on physical harm, and now we moved into trying to understand emotional and psychological harm, where you have emotional distress. And then, trauma is another concept that has been inflated in society at large, but also in our work, where the term trauma gets used a lot, even though we're not always precise in what we mean by trauma. And so it becomes harder to measure concept like emotional harm or trauma when we're using it interchangeably with other less harmful concepts or experiences. And so it becomes more challenging as we expand our notions of harm. There's good that comes out of this. It's good that we just don't think about physical abuse because that was too limiting. But when you use concepts like emotional harm, which are really important to consider, you also need to be precise about these concepts so that you're not including non-harmful or less harmful experiences within this concept of emotional or psychological harm. For example, um, we know that based on Folletti's studies in the 1990s and beyond, um, divorce is considered to be an adverse childhood experience. So divorce is considered to be harmful for children. Well, not all children. Um, and to suggest that divorce itself is an adverse childhood experience suggests that it's more harmful than it perhaps is for many. What is more harmful is the exposure to conflict. And so we need to be careful of how we talk about divorce as being harmful because we may have people who want to stay together for the kids so that they're not harmed, even though they're probably more harmed staying in a fake relationship, a fake family where there's no love between the parents than if they were to separate. And we have research that shows that children do better when their parents are not doing well in the marriage when they actually divorce. And so we have to be careful of what we mean by harm and how we're measuring it. Social harm. So now we move into not just at the interpersonal level. This is where you bring in the ecology of violence. Now we're talking about social harms and recognizing that actions or policies themselves can have negative effects on communities and how these discriminatory practices or policies can be harmful. You look at some of the school policies that have been found to be racist, and they have been found to further discriminate. So we now have this notion of social harm, and again, good things come from expanding our notions of harm, but we need to be careful about how we go about measuring and how we go about assessing these new expanded ways of thinking about harm. Another example is economic harm. Financial abuse wasn't considered to be one of the forms of violence. Many, many years ago, when we were thinking about, partner assault or, domestic violence, but financial abuse has become more important as it's been shown, in many studies about the impact of financial abuse on individuals as a further way of controlling. I talked about the online harm, the technology aspects of harm. And so we move into the digital realm. Well, then we're confronted with cyberbullying and online harassment and privacy violations, exposure to harmful content. And so this adds a whole new layer and level of harm that we did not think about, 10, 20 years ago. And 20 years ago, it was about 20 years ago that we were doing our first focus groups with high school kids about their experiences with what was called cyberbullying. borrowed from bullying, but what was happening online. And they were talking about how the cyberbullying was happening on this thing called Facebook. And we were scratching our heads thinking, what is Facebook? And we had to go look for Facebook to figure out what it was. And now, 20 years later, the kids are no longer using Facebook. It's the older people, like, my generation and older, who are using Facebook to keep their family and friends entertained about, their travels or the the food that they made or whatever. Um, and this is not even a thing now. My kids don't use Facebook. I don't think they even have Facebook accounts. So the technology around all of this changes so fast. And so for us as evaluators, how to keep up with this technology so that we can be informed about how harm is being played out in a world that we're not necessarily familiar with. Harm to reputation is another expansion of harm. Now we're not just talking about physical violence or psychological or financial. We're also talking about reputation. What happens if somebody's reputation has been damaged and they've been defamed, or there's been false accusations made against them, and the harm that comes from that. And so now we need to grapple with that type of harm. So when we deal with false accusations, it's not just about making accusations that are false, but if these are malicious and they get at somebody's reputation, then that is harmful, and that would be considered within the realm of harm, perhaps even depending on the situation within the realm of violence. And then we also include cultural harm. And we've been more recently discovering that you know certain forms of denying cultural heritage and traditions and languages has been extremely harmful and intergenerationally traumatizing when people have not been able to express their culture. It's something that wasn't thought about at a societal level. And for example, many of the professional bodies, like in Canada, the Canadian Association of Social Workers actually recommended residential schools for Indigenous children in the 1940s. The idea that it was going to help them acculturate. When you think back about that in terms of what we know now, in terms of the abuse that occurred in residential schools, and the plight of Indigenous children and families, and how intergenerationally they've been scarred by this this genocide. It's not something that necessarily was on the minds of those supporting those types of initiatives in the 40s, but we must be aware, because the damage that we have done cross-culturally. You look at slavery, you look at you look at the Holocaust. There's many different examples of cultural harm that have been committed, and so our notion of cultural harm has expanded our notions of harm as well. And then we have symbolic harm, the gestures and languages that can carry harmful connotations. The flags that people can put up on their front lawns, or you look at the artifacts, the statues of people who have not been on the right side of history. So we see universities change their names away from those symbols to try and address the symbolic harms that have happened. And so again, these are all expansion of our notions of harm. And so this notion of expansion has both benefits and limitations. So we can see the expansion on a horizontal level and also on a vertical level. On a horizontal level, we see the spread from the original meaning to encompass a broad range of harms, such as cyberbullying, adult workplace bullying, where we now have different forms of bullying, not just bullying, but we have these other broader applications. And then we have this vertical semantic inflation, where less extreme forms of harm are now considered within this umbrella of harm. So, for example, bullying used to be considered intentional and repeated behaviors to cause harm. That was the definition of bullying. Now it occurs in all kinds of contexts. People say, "You're bullying me," and now that gets included within our notions of harm. The challenge of an evaluator is that we need to be thinking about definitions. We need to be thinking about these semantic inflations and how are we defining these inflations? With what measure are we able to assess? How can we differentiate various forms of harm, the severity of harm within these semantic inflations? And so it makes our work more complicated when we're trying to assess for the presence or absence of harm when we have both horizontal and vertical inflations around these concepts of harm. So let's just look at some examples here. So horizontal semantic inflation. If you were to get almond milk in your coffee, that's a semantic inflation. We now include almond milk. If you go to a coffee shop that has all kinds of different milk and you ask them, other than 1% or 2% or skim milk, what else do you have? And now they'll throw in a whole bunch of milks that are not even milks. I mean, almond is not necessarily a milk. It's within now the umbrella of what we consider to be milk, but it is a horizontal semantic inflation. And just like this picture of Heineken 0.0% alcohol beer, is that really beer? If there's no alcohol in it, what defines beer? Is it the taste? Is it the texture? Is it the fuzz? Is it that it comes in a green Heineken bottle or a can? And so we have this less harmful product because it doesn't have alcohol in it, and it now is included within this this vertical expansion of beer to include variety of percentages of alcohol, and this one including none, and so but what are the consequences of drinking 0.0% alcohol beer? Is it better or worse than water, for example? So we need to be asking questions whenever we make these expansions, either horizontally or vertically. So evaluators should be concerned with concept creep. It's important for us to be mindful of these expansions, because when we do evaluations, we need to be able to consider a wide range of abusive behaviors that are being alleged and that we are observing. And not all of them is going to be within typical notions of harm. And we may not have good measures to assess these expanding concepts of harm, but we don't want to dismiss them because we can't measure them. We don't want to dismiss them because we don't understand them. For example, gaslighting is a new term that there's now research or at least some literature on. We need to know that literature. We need to be able to understand what is gaslighting and what is it not, how to differentiate between that type of behavior and some other type of behavior. And so it does expand the scope of the assessment. We need to be more nuanced in our screening tools. We cannot just use screening tools that capture certain types of violence, such as physical, sexual, psychological, because if we're not tapping into legal abuse or gaslighting or coercive control or pet abuse or all these other forms of violence, then we're not thoroughly screening for family violence. We're screening for a specific type of violence. And so we need to be aware of these growing expansions of these concepts related to violence. We need to be on top of new iterations of concepts or expansions of concepts. We need to be sensitive to subtle expansions, especially those that are non-physical forms of violence, to improve our accuracy in the assessments. We need to make sure that we're understanding the impact of financial abuse. What is financial abuse? How does one measure financial abuse? How does one intervene when there's been found to be financial abuse? What interventions specifically work for financial abuse that may not work for other forms of abuse? And so it requires the evaluator to become much more knowledgeable and aware of the various forms of violence. We also need to be able to prioritize safety by looking at these various forms of abuse and making sure that we are being clear about what is of concern specifically in terms of safety and well-being, and how do we make sense of these broader ranges of potential harms that we may not be able to articulate, we may not be able to describe in sufficient detail because the terms themselves still may be vague. For example, there are some definitions of gaslighting that have been coming into our discourse, and we see literature now that's trying to describe gaslighting, but most of it has been written in the media, so they're newspaper articles, and I wouldn't rely on a newspaper article to help me with my definition of a term that I need to assess and then make sense of within my evaluation. And I also need to be careful that I'm not using one size fits all definitions. So specifically, what does it look like for this family? What does it look like for these individuals? And which also means that when we're asking people about these notions of harm, we need to understand what they mean by their definitions. What do they think they mean when they say gaslighting, or when they say coercive control, or whatever term that they may be using? So some of the challenges of expanding concepts is that one is that we may dilute the seriousness of certain forms of violence. If everything is considered to be violent, then we may be minimizing the impact of harm. And with these broader definitions, we may be overgeneralizing and treating too much as harmful, and therefore, equivalent forms of harm, thereby dismissing the more serious forms of harm. So we need to be thinking differentially about harm and about severity and about frequency and about context and about the nature and about how to make sense of these forms of violence, so that we're not putting them all into the same the same bowl and just stirring it around, because it's going to make it even more messy. Misapplication. When we have broad definitions of harm, we lead to inconsistencies. I read a judge's summation a couple weeks ago, where the judge suggested that having an affair was a form of family violence. Well, I think that could be argued either way. In both situations, we don't have clear definitions that help us understand an affair as being a form of family violence. And so it becomes an interpretation of professionals, not guided by the literature, not guided by current understanding about these concepts. And so we can really then move into a uncharted territory, where we're starting to throw terms around and notions of harm around without necessarily being able to defend or to clearly articulate why we're using those terms in those specific situations and what are the potential implications of doing so. And then what happens then is that there could be backlash or resistance, both from professionals such as evaluators and family lawyers and judges, but also from the public perception at large. You look at the term gaslighting, for example. It's leading to skepticism about its origin, about its use, about its utility, and even though there is, there's good use of the word gaslighting, there are some specific consequences to that specific type of behavior. But because it's being overused, then it has less impact, and people then resist the use of it. Like trauma, for example. Everything is trauma, therefore nothing is traumatic. If we all have this skeptical view of the word trauma. So bringing it back to family violence, we look at examples of cyber abuse. I mentioned the technology, legal abuse, the misuse of legal process to control former partners. And this is a new form of family violence that is being found in literature. Again, I mentioned financial, child support related abuse. We have gaslighting has been mentioned, coercive control. There's now attempts to put coercive control into legislation, which has its consequences if we don't have good measures and if it gets overgeneralized to beyond the case specific. And so we need to be thinking clearly about the language that we're using that shapes our perceptions. And this is the problem with over expanding our concepts in a way that does not necessarily articulate what we mean by those concepts, is that it leads to labels, it leads to pathologizing, it leads to having terms that cannot be objectively critiqued. If you have an interpretation of a concept, a label, it's hard to argue your value that you put into that. And so it can lead to normalization, and it can have a downplay of severity in terms of harm if we normalize the experience. So if everybody's traumatized, then no one's really traumatized, and therefore we just sort of normalize that just trauma is just part of life. And we don't then necessarily look at those situations where, no, actually, this is an unresolved trauma with very specific trauma activations that are occurring, and it's beyond being a normal response. And then also condemnation for for experiencing um, these forms of harm when others have ridiculed them or downplayed them. So to say that one has been traumatized now can be met with resistance because of the way that the term itself has been bounced around and overused by people. And so there's a skepticism now of the term trauma. We also need to be thinking about inclusive language. So the APA put out, and this is a really good resource for anybody doing evaluation work, to use inclusive language. So rather than victim and perpetrator, APA is suggesting that we use person impacted by violence and person who uses violence. So again, less labeling, less pathologizing. It doesn't condone the behavior, but it helps to explain with more precision without the labels. How far should we go in expanding our concepts of family violence? So here is a report by Arman and Company where they suggest that parental alien behaviors should be a form of family violence. But what are the consequences of doing that? One of the consequences would be that if you were to label parental alienation as violence, then that would open up the opportunities to use legal remedies that were not previously available to them, such as restraining orders or those other legal remedies that have been created to protect people from violence. Is this how we want to be dealing with parental alienation? When we look at parental alien behaviors, it's been suggested that that these behaviors could be considered to be psychologically harmful and therefore should be included within the umbrella of family violence if they're severe. The problem is which ones. We don't have consensus about which one of those behaviors. There's indication of the 17 indicators of parental alienating behaviors. Not all of those would be considered to be psychologically harmful. And so it would be an overgeneralization, and which could then result in weaponizing the further alienation as a form of violence to suggest that it should be included that way. And so we need to be really careful about what is in our umbrella of types of violence, and then also what decisions do we make as a community? What decisions do we make as evaluators of what gets included and not included within that umbrella of family violence? Because the implications are serious. Regardless of what gets included in the umbrella of family violence or not, we need to be precise. We need to be aware of the parameters of these concepts, and we need to be clear about how to measure those parameters, those indicators, so that we can make sense of the definitional aspects of these concepts. When we look at being practical in terms of our evaluation work, we need to, first of all, be clear about how we go about doing our evaluations. We need to make sure that we are using in-depth interviews. We're asking people, we're sitting down, what do you mean by that term? When you say gaslighting, what are you referring to? Tell me about that. Give me examples of that. So we need to be really specific in the way that we go about our evaluations about concepts of harm so that we can tap into these semantic inflations. Validated tools, I'll talk about that next time. There's a variety of tools out there and they do different things. They measure different forms of violence and with different purposes. And so we can't just grab any tool. We need to make sure that we are grabbing the correct tool for what we're trying to assess. We need detailed reports. We need to make sure that we identify the forms of abuse and the impacts of the family, and we are descriptive. We are using level 1 inference to describe the what it is that we are observing as a form of violence and the impacts that we are observing before we make any higher level inference about the violence, or else it just gets lost and we lose clarity of definition, we lose precision. We need to make sure that recommendations are tailored to the specific types of violence and abuse identified, and that if, for example, digital violence has been found to be a part of our evaluations, then what are we offering specifically around the technology to help people be more safe? Safety plans need to be developed to identify the individual identified risks to each person, and so that we're not overgeneralizing. There's too much overgeneralizing when we talk about family violence because it's complicated. We need to break it down and be clear and be precise in the way that we describe. We need to use guidelines, AFCC guidelines, APA has guidelines for evaluations. We need to be following those and making sure that we are doing our due diligence to fully understand the various forms of violence and understanding the impact of semantic inflations. So just some things to consider as we wrap up here. Number one, look for other cyber terms that cause confusion. So I've talked about gaslighting, I've talked about coercive control. What other factors, what other terms, what other concepts create confusion when we try and apply it to the context of evaluation work? And so be mindful of the terms that you are coming across so that you're having you're understanding the definitional issues or challenges with that term. Don't just take a term and go with it. When somebody says to you, I've experienced violence. Well, what do you mean by that? And what does that look like? And how have you experienced and how have you felt about it? And how what impact has this had? And be as specific around the terms as possible. It's really interesting to look historically at concept creep and semantic inflation. You look at family violence, I've mentioned, you go back to the 60s, you look at where it originated from with physical abuse being really the only type of violence being considered. And then that left a mark of being only focused on physical abuse, and there's no pun intended there. And then so that made it slowly for other forms of violence to be considered. And even now, there are folks who focus more on the physical violence than on the emotional or the psychological. And part of that is a measurement problem. It's easier to measure, unfortunately, physical harm than other forms of harm. And we're going to get into indicators of harm in the third session, and we'll have some discussions about that. Do scientists mean the same thing today as they did before when they were mentioning other forms of violence? And you look back at that literature, is it the same, or are these terms evolving over time? And it's really important to understand what the term means today and how it's being applied today. And then what debates do they boil down to parties talking past each other because they have unclear definitions? So you've gaslighted me. What does that mean to you? Tell me more about that use of the word. And so the more that we become educators of clarity, and we ask people to define their definitions, then the easier it will be for us to make sense of competing claims, because oftentimes we don't know whether these are competing claims because they have clear definitional distinction, or whether this is competing claims because they're just, there's overlap, but they're looking at it from a different perspective. Here's my contact information. If you have any questions about anything I said, feel free to reach out to me, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.